Since Marx and Engels, numerous scholars have argued that the makeup of Athenian society vindicates the Marxist perspective on universal class struggle. Our question is simple: is this so? Let's start with a quick lecture on Marx. His theory of historical materialism views contradictions in class and economic status as the motor for historical progress towards emancipation, being free and enlightened. This also explains historical change retroactively, as each change was an inevitable step towards a better future. Those contradictions are different in each step in history. In capitalism, for example, the working class provides labour at a value lower than its worth, creating profit for higher classes. What's unique to the capitalist level is the industrialisation of labour and the accumulative attitude towards capital. No longer is money just there to buy stuff you need. A capitalist is concerned with commodities only insofar as they can be exchanged or used for the accumulation of capital. Now, whilst the working class produces things, it is the middle class that owns the means of producing and selling those things, such as factories, tools, textiles, retailers, trucks, ships, trains, and so on. They are incentivized to extrapolate as much labour power for as little cost as possible. The lower the cost, the greater the capital profit. This is the essence of class exploitation. The arrangement is contradictory because it deprives the working class of the money it needs to consume the goods that they are producing and on which the profits of the middle class depend. In seeking to maintain their profits in the short term, the middle class undermine demand for their products in the long term. The market contracts, leading to depressions and deflationary spirals. This is when, still according to Marx, capitalism reaches crisis point. Either the contradictions are resolved into a classless society, or capitalism regresses into archaic forms of social control, undermining the liberal assumption of a natural marriage between capitalism and liberal democracy, leading to stuff like fascism. So, where does that leave classical Athens? Capitalism is just the final contradiction before it resolves into a higher synthesis: communism. Before capitalism, other systems saw their own contradictions between economic classes. In all of them, money was, for the most part, a means of exchanging commodities. The end is not capital, but the ownership and use of desired products. Money is there simply to make bartering easier. It is often thought that the ancients have a strong aversion to work. And while it is true that for a free man it is shameful to work for a fellow free citizen, most of the free citizens provide for their own livelihood through ordinary labour. By the 4th century BC, the majority of free citizens work for money, but it is self-employment that is the norm. Most free men own their own means of production. This makes sense when we consider that for the Athenian, the home was the centre of economic production. It's even where we get the modern word, economy from. Oika means house, or ika, and nemein means management, so management of the house. By the 5th century BC, we see that about half of Attica's population is involved in a vast array of non-agricultural trades, around 200 different occupations in all. Specialisation is typically horizontal, meaning that individual specialists produce and sell goods like clothes, tools, works of art, and so on. Others offer specialist services, such as teaching rhetoric. This is remarkably different from the vertical specialisation central to industrial economies of the modern era, in which several specialists collaborate to produce single complex items, what is known as a division of labour. The other half owns and operates their own farm, though they rely heavily on the labour of unfree citizens, such as women and slaves. The farmers cultivated to provide for themselves and would only sell or barter any excess in the local market, the agora. The coinage system that came into existence around the 6th century BC functions just so that excess value can be traded for something that you can't provide for yourself. There are elite landholdings of a larger size with a higher output, which is geared towards production for the market. The owner does not supervise the work. That was down to hired bailiffs, who typically are free citizens. And as I said earlier, this is indeed considered shameful and would only be done out of dire necessity. These landowners sell or barter excess produce on the agora, the marketplace. Again, not for the sake of acquiring capital like you see in capitalism. Money is strictly a form of exchange, a way of formalising the bartering process, namely by setting standards of value according to weights of silver. But it is not sought for its own sake. And likewise, profits were not typically used to enhance one's own productive capacity in order to make more money. It's because of this that this period was so technologically stagnant. The incentive to invest and increase output or efficiency is simply not there. Then what is excess money used for? In essence, money should be spent to benefit the polis or the city. It will provide funds for public works or allow you to be a better public participant. Those with an excess of money can buy time off from work, which can be spent for sustaining public duties, developing public virtues. Overall, the work ethic of the 6th century poet, Hesiod, was more common than the aversion, the aristocratic aversion, to work. As Hesiod said, "Work is no shame." It was principally the leisured elite who looked upon any form of work as beneath them, as getting in the way of their public duties and their care of the self. Sounds familiar. But is this to say that there was nothing akin to class exploitation, and principally for the sake of wealth and power? To answer this, we must first determine how to define class in ancient Athens. And this is where things get tricky. The classicist Robin Osborne argues that the defining feature of Athenian democracy is its homogeneity, or lack of distinction in class. This very much follows from the idea that most citizens worked for themselves and were more or less equal under law. And indeed, the evidence is that income and living standards in the classical period, so 5th century, were relatively equal. Homogeneity also reflects the overlapping interests in social life brought about by a political system geared towards corporatism. But isn't that an incredible claim? Surely, the constant battling between politicians representing the people and those of the aristocracy constitute warring factions premised on economic grievances. And yes, there was class distinction in early classical Athens. It reflected archaic life, where the upper class consolidated their position through various tactics of monopolization of land, by buying out less fortunate farmers, and of values in employing the Homeric standard on excellence and the divine notion of fate as justification for their superior rank. Athenian statesman Solon created a formal distinction between classes with a gradient according to economic status. These were not just economic classes though. In fact, they empowered formerly powerless social classes. The citizens were differentiated economically to determine eligibility for political office and fundamentally to deprive the aristocratic nobility of its monopoly of office. The top two classes were granted rights to senior magistrates, the third access to the lower administrative process, and the fourth a place in the assembly, which soon became a regular institution of the city. After Solon, the tyrant Pisistratus empowered the lower classes even further by providing their thetes, the lowest classes, with public loans to ensure the survival of self-employment among the small and medium-sized farmers. Tyranny proved to be a transitional phenomenon, assisting in the emergence of the classical world out of the archaic. Solon's arrangement of class as a political system lapsed over time and was completely superseded by yet another statesman who goes by the name Clisthenes. His reforms makes Athens comparatively more egalitarian. See, he creates 10 tribes comprised of a mix of the old geographical tribes. He also institutes balloting by lot for an expanded council of 500 to preside over public affairs in conjunction with the public assembly. It did remain the case that the richest had the greatest political advantage, not least because they had more leisure time to commit to public affairs and could afford instruction on rhetorical and political skill from sophists, many of whom travelled in from various parts of the ancient world to make a living in Athens. But no matter the relative differences in income, the corporate nature of Athenian democracy was such that no citizen was in a position in which they had to sell their labour or themselves against their wishes. So far, we can conclude that economic class struggle did not exist in a Marxist sense, and that political classes were increasingly mobile as Athens developed. But until now, we haven't talked about what Marxist historian Perry Anderson described as the real exploited working class: women, foreigners, and enslaved people. Wives of citizens aren't formally employed by the household, but they are still responsible for it. This includes making garments, managing the slaves, providing and preparing the food, and caring for the children. Unmarried women were uncommon, but they existed, typically entering the mysteries of Demeter. Basically, they became nuns. Additionally, foreigners, also known as metics, are technically free men, but not citizens. Most live in Piraeus, the major port serving Athens, selling, trading, and shipping goods across the Aegean, and fulfill a central role in Athens' maritime trading. Metics don't have political rights, and so their economic activity is determined outside of their say. They are often shortchanged or could easily have their assets seized with little right to appeal. Whilst not slaves, they are not far off. It's very common to own an actual enslaved person. In fact, it is considered shameful not to have at least two. They are taken from all over the Hellenic world, but especially from Anatolia, Syria, Thrace, and the Black Sea. The fact that they came cheap in part explains this attitude, as does the Athenian sense of superiority. It is the democratic essence of the Athenian polis, however, that principally drives this attitude to slavery. With each reform, from Solon to Clisthenes, the number of slaves increases dramatically. The relative egalitarianism among the Athenian citizenry was always proportionate to the degree of slavery. Some enslaved people did well for themselves and were well looked after. It was not unusual to have slaves working in upwardly mobile occupations, such as money lending. But as you might have expected, most enslaved people had an awful time. Public slaves, so slaves without an individual owner, are put to work in the silver mines and marble quarries in service of the community. The conditions are dismal. A great many perish in the caves and the quarries, or irreparably battered their bodies in both. They aren't usually allowed leisure time, or only little of it. The philosopher Xenophon even proposed making slaves work for 360 days per year. No leisure for slaves was a common saying. But the very existence of slavery was also what allowed for the Athenian lifestyle. I'll go a step further than that. It was a requisite. For free men to be truly free and to engage with his public duties and improve the city, others were needed to do the labour. And so here we find an uncomfortable truth on classical Athens. Liberty and slavery were indivisible. Each was the structural condition of the other. We cannot imagine the possibility of Athens' cultural splendour without its brutal practices on slavery. In Marxist terms, this constituted a slave mode of production. Sure, there were other modes of production, and indeed there are multiple modes of production in most times. But it is with the Greek world of antiquity that slavery becomes the main mode of production, much more so than it was for ancient Egypt, for example. This is not just true of Athens. Spartan society and its superior hoplite force was founded on the enslavement of the Messenians, known as the Helots. Athenian democracy depends ultimately on the exploitation and hard labour of many people, many Greeks and foreigners in fact. More people were excluded from the free life than included, roughly a ratio of 3 to 1. One does not need to be a Marxist to recognise the brutality of the Athenian world, but what makes for a Marxist position is the belief that the Athenian slave mode of production is a stage in the process of material history. Classical Marxist scholars didn't think so. Though maintaining class struggle is universal in human history, they thought that ancient Greece was too infantile and undeveloped to really count as one of its significant stages, representing a kind of pre-material history, referring really to the material of production. Technology and production were relatively simple. Too simple, it seemed. But British intellectual Perry Anderson argues that medieval feudalism, a stage outlined by Marx, is a sum of the Greek slave mode of production and the primitive or Germanic mode of production. Feudalism's contradictions are said by Marx to be resolved by capitalism, only to generate new contradictions and lead to new struggle and so forth. By this account, the ancient world is but one instance in a universal material history in which capitalism is the final stage of historical class exploitation, just before communism, the end to which all exploitation was leading. So, can we use Marxian theories to understand the ancient Greek world? Or better, does ancient Athens fit the world history theory of continuous class struggle? How we answer that depends on our own view of history. If all exploitation, including Greek slavery, leads to the end of history, then sure. But is there an end to history? And if so, what is the mechanism driving this? Or maybe history is random and discontinuous and Marx was wrong. Then Athenian class struggle is merely a simplified projection of a theory onto history, ignoring the complex nuances of history and undermining the suffering of people on the notion of historical redemption, that time will deliver us from our trials and tribulations. Who knows? Let us know what you think in the comments below. This is only the second video on this channel, but we've got many dozens in the pipeline. So stick around and subscribe. And you can really help us grow by sharing to anyone you meet, either online or in the real world. Thanks for watching until the end, well done, cheers, and yasas.